Family cat goes missing, then 4 years later they spot an exact replica at the pet store. On Valentine's Day, Michelle Wright was on a date with the man who would eventually become her husband, babysitting her sister's pregnant cat. That was how they witnessed the birth of Fuzzy, a black and white cat they would make a part of their family. As she and her now husband grew closer, Fuzzy was right there with them. So when the cat bolted away from a friend's house in 2010, Michelle was devastated. Fuzzy had been such a huge part of her life. How could she ever replace her? Well, a visit to the pet store answered her question in the most unexpected way. Michelle Wright's heart broke when her beloved cat Fuzzy escaped from a friend's home. Deeply affected by the loss, she scoured her Barrington, New Hampshire community for several weeks in July 2010, searching for her fur baby. Michelle kept her diligent search for Fuzzy going until a neighbor came to her with unsettling news. The neighbor had witnessed something that seemingly made Michelle's search mission futile. One of her friend's neighbors had told me that a black and white cat that resembled him had been struck by a car, which was extremely devastating, Michelle told WMUR TV News. I was a mess for quite a while and had given up for the most part, Michelle continued. She was filled with resentment for herself, as if she could have done something to stop these events. Picturing innocent Fuzzy deceased was too much for her to handle. And though this was true, there was a part of her that kept faith that Fuzzy was somewhere out there alive. I was devastated, but I would always keep my eye out for him when I was in the area, Michelle relayed. 4 years later, still no sign of Fuzzy. Michelle and her husband stopped into Barrington Pet Connection, pet supply store. It was there that she was finally met with a sign. And when we say sign, we literally mean what Michelle sensed was Fuzzy's face. See, the Cocheco Valley Humane Society had a section in the store with animals up for adoption, one being a familiar-looking black and white kitty. His name was Molson. Michelle asked for Molson's story. The Pet Connection had been fostering him in support of the Dover, New Hampshire shelter for just about a week. A far cry from the 4 years Fuzzy was missing, but really, he had quite a story. See, the Pet Connection was taking care of this Fuzzy look-alike right before Michelle found her way back to him. The poor feline had apparently been bouncing back and forth between families and the shelter for quite a while. The Cocheco Family Humane Society had rehomed Molson 2 separate times. The first time he was adopted by a woman, but that living situation only lasted 7 months. Who would dare get rid of that mushy little face? The second time, a family adopted the cat, later returning him when they moved away from the area. But this was also an interesting development. His name was changed to Molson by his last owner, Michelle said. She needed to know more about this cat. I had said to my husband, wow, he looks an awful lot like Fuzzy. And I asked how old he was, and she said according to the shelter, he was 4 years old. And at that very moment, I knew, Michelle explained. Michelle was filled with emotions. She was going to prove this cat was her Fuzzy. She was really adamant about it. Like, that's my cat, I swear. That looks just like my cat. I'm going to have to bring in pictures, recalled Jessie Center, the owner of the Pet Connection. And then the next day, she brought in pictures, and lo and behold, they matched up everything to the paw prints and colors and markings and everything, she continued. It was a perfect match. When Michelle saw the memorable black spot on the bottom of his paw, she couldn't help but get teary-eyed. I just started bawling. I don't know how and I don't know why, but I don't care, Michelle exclaimed. Michelle was more than happy to shell out the $85 adoption fee to reclaim her cherished kitty, who she'd been gravely missing for 4 years. The fee also covered the implanting of a microchip so Fuzzy's identity would never again be a mystery. And not only was their unlikely reunion one filled with love, but the story behind Michelle's initial encounter with Fuzzy, as a kitten too, was one for the books. He was a Valentine's Day cat, she said. As Fuzzy propped himself up on Michelle, his tiny paws resting on her knees, she felt the strong connection to Fuzzy. She felt the strong connection to Fuzzy she felt on Valentine's Day 2009. Fuzzy was finally home. If I never believed in miracles before, I do now, she said. Whether or not you believe in miracles, you have to admit that Michelle Wright's and Fuzzy's reunion is marvelous. Perhaps you'd rather call it a stroke of luck. Whatever you wish to call it, it happens more than you'd think. From America's New Hampshire to southeast England's Hampshire, people and pets are reuniting. Joe and Ade Hay from Steubenton, Hampshire, got Charlie when he was just 7 weeks old. He was the sweetest little black and white kitten with glowing green eyes, and the English couple was happy to welcome him to his forever home. Charlie lived a happy life with his new parents in the suburban village of Steubenton, which he loved adventuring through. They trusted Charlie enough to let him walk around the south coast of England, confident he always made it home safely. This went on for 9 years, so imagine the Hayes' shock when one day in 2006, Charlie never came back home to his family. They did their best to avoid panicking, as this wouldn't solve anything. Instead, they made it their mission to find their fur baby. The anguished couple put up lost cat posters around the neighborhood and desperately contacted local veterinarian offices and animal shelters in hopes that someone brought Charlie in. Alas, this was all to no avail. Sadly, life had to go on. Joe and Ade couldn't grieve forever. The couple wound up packing up and moving to a new neighborhood over 2 miles from the house that they once owned and raised Charlie in. The couple hadn't visited their previous charming village in quite a while, but Joe stopped by the town they once called home when her mother was looking to purchase a property in that region in 2012. Anything for Mom. My mom's sister and I were looking at a place close to the house Ade and I lived in when Charlie went missing, said Joe. Being back in their old stomping grounds brought back memories of Charlie. If it wasn't for the bungalow my mom's sister and I were looking at, we wouldn't have been around there, she continued. Perhaps there was more than one reason Joe was brought back to the area. It originally seemed like just an uneventful trip back to their old neighborhood, when suddenly Joe spotted an oddly familiar-looking black and white cat outside a house. It looked like a replica of Charlie. When we saw this cat on a wall outside a house, I was immediately 99.9% sure it was Charlie, Joe recalled. But since she hadn't seen her precious fur ball in about 6 years, it would be a miracle if it were really him. He was a lot skinnier, but came straight over to me and responded to his name, Joe explained. But of course, the cat could have just been responding to sound. She needed to know for sure. Joe had a strong gut feeling that this random cat in her former neighborhood was in fact her missing pet, so she did what any crazy cat lady would do. She took him. Joe immediately booked it to the animal shelter she worked at as a receptionist to check the wandering mystery cat for a microchip, as her and her engineer husband had once implanted in Charlie. The microchip test would reveal the truth. Unbelievably, the microchip test revealed that this enigma of a cat truly was Charlie, who was 16 years old as of 2012. I am over the moon to have him back. We shed a few tears when the microchip test worked, Joe gushed. It was fate. Joe went and spoke to the man who lived in the house she found Charlie in front of, where she learned that he'd been feeding Charlie for nearly 2.5 years. If only Charlie could talk to tell the tales of his 6-year journey. Charlie had always been quite a friendly cat. When we lived in Steubenton, he would often go down to the nearby stables where they would feed him, so it's no surprise he found someone to look after him in the intervening years, Joe explained. Joe and Ade were beyond grateful to have their 4-legged friend back in their home. But things were much different in the Hay household since Charlie had last lived with them, as the family now had 2 other cats, 2 dogs, and beautiful twin babies, Drew and Daniela. Though he was always a mischievous, fun-loving outdoor kitty, Joe and Ade were understandably wary of the idea of letting him outside again. Regarding the idea, Joe then stated, "We will eventually, but I don't know when I'll be brave enough. He's got the meow of an older cat now, and you can tell he's grown up into an older boy. He's settling back in and doesn't seem too fazed by the children." Joe relayed of Charlie's progress. The Hays had always wondered what happened to Charlie after he disappeared, but that no longer mattered. Charlie was finally home. Though the story of Joe and Ade's runaway cat is miraculous, cats are survivors, and this kind of thing happens more than you think. Though not all pet owners get microchips implanted in their cats, there are other ways of confirming that a lost cat is your cat. John Gullah was craving both responsibility and love one day in 2012, so he followed in the footsteps of so many young adults before him and went searching for the perfect pet. When he saw 2 cats, Julie and her brother Jack, John knew he'd found the perfect pair. He brought the 2 home and let them run hog wild around his place. The kittens cuddled together, they played together. They were a delight. This made it particularly painful when shortly after the adoption, John had to leave Julie and Jack with his mother. He was off to college and wasn't into the idea of hiding cats in his dorm room. John's mother, Lorinda, welcomed the kittens into her abode because, come on, who wouldn't? Julie had a little white spot on her fur that made her just so darn cute, but her joy in living with the two kittens was unexpectedly cut short. Being that she was a cat and prone to bizarre fits of panic, Julie took off running one day. Just scooted out the door and headed down the street. I couldn't find her, Lorinda recalled. I was just beside myself. Devastated by the breakup of his dynamic kitten duo, John teamed up with his mom to find the missing feline. They wandered the neighborhood, hanging up posters, jiggling bags of cat treats, and calling Julie. Frantic searches for the cat halted, however, when the doctors diagnosed John with lymphoma. With a fight for his life now ahead of him, he could no longer focus on the cat he so dearly loved. 6 years passed. John beat cancer, married his longtime girlfriend, found a new job, and set up shop in Indianapolis, 25 miles away from his old home in Carmel. Things were looking up, but he never stopped thinking about Julie. Perhaps it was for that reason his mother was browsing Paw Boost, Lost and Found Pets, a page on Facebook dedicated to reuniting pet owners with, well, their lost pets. A certain post on it piqued her interest. A woman named Christine McKeon wrote that she'd recently seen a cat under a shed in her backyard. The cat, she noted, was skittish and just a little bit mean. It didn't sound anything like Julie. Most concerning of all was that the post didn't mention the white spot on Julie's belly, which would have been a good detail to include, Lorinda thought, or someone trying to find the cat's owner. Still, even after 6 years, she, like John, was drawn to the idea that Julie was definitely still out there looking for them. She knew they'd be kicking themselves for the rest of their lives if they didn't follow up with Christine. So John made the drive, white-knuckle clenching the steering wheel in anticipation. In less than half an hour, he arrived at Christine's house and stood before the shed a mean, stray black cat called home. With every ounce of love he could muster, just as he and his mother had done 6 years before, in the streets of suburbia, John called Julie's name, and nothing happened. But understanding that cats are cats and don't really come when you call, John gave it another go. "Julie," he called. "Julie." Then, 2 glowing eyes peeked out at John from the darkness beneath the shed. John in her sights, the cats once called mean and skittish emerged. She came out running from under the shed, Christina recalled. Like, "Oh hey, I know this guy." Soon she was face to face with John, and then she started purring like a lawnmower engine. She rubbed against John's legs, and after he bent down to pick her up, she crawled right up onto his shoulders. Still, John needed to be convinced that this was his Julie. "I turned her around and I said, 'Does she have a white spot?'" John explained. The folks gathered around confirmed she has a white spot on her stomach. John couldn't believe it. After 6 years, he finally found his cat. In that moment of reunion, John pet Julie and noticed her fur was surprisingly well kept. To him, it meant that she only recently moved in under the shed. Someone had been taking care of her over the years. Delighted to have his cat back, John looked forward to another reunion, Julie and Jack's. Would the siblings even remember the short time they spent together? Would they get along? All of John's anxieties melted away, however, when he put Julie down beside Jack for the first time. The two went right back to their old tricks, running around and playing together. John was overwhelmed. "It's almost like seeing a ghost or something," he said, of seeing Julie in his home. Still, this was one ghost John was happy to have haunt his house. John couldn't help but be thankful to whoever cared for Julie over those 6 years. There wasn't a chance in the world she would have made it on her own over that time. Oddly, though, some animals do prove surprisingly self-sufficient on their own.